Hello, everybody. I'm Henry Neufeld of Energion Publications. I'm the publisher, and I'm talking today with Dan Dixson, who is an ordained minister in the Disciples of Christ, Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and has done considerable study about dealing with people facing life crisis, death, loss, grief, and has put that into a new book titled When the Casseroles Are Gone. Those who've lived in church probably get his title if you've lived around a church for any period of time. So, welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Henry.
Okay, we're going to get right into this. Let me tell everybody that at the end of the video, we'll put up the cover of the book and we will have both a link and a QR code that you can use to get more information or to order a copy. I mentioned the QR code early, so if you're watching this on your computer or something, you have a phone camera, you can point that at it and it'll take you directly to the book page. So that'll be up at the end of the video. So let's just get going. A lot of people don't write books. So what made you decide to take your topic into writing a book?
Well, originally, I had no plans to write a book. It was a workshop idea or retreat setting for faith communities. I felt that there was a need, and but between finding faith communities that might be that interested, and then COVID happened, and I was working full time. After I retired, I decided, you know what, let's just put it out there in a book. And so really it was a workshop idea to begin with, and that I thought was important, and so we turned it into a book.
Okay, so something then led you to the idea of doing a workshop topic. And I know from experience you're going to, if you're talking to almost any church group that I've talked to, you're going to find a lot of people who have experienced loss or dealing with it, dealing with grief or so on. So I have a bit of an idea of what would lead you that way. But so what led you into this particular topic? I notice in your bio you've done a lot of study and worked with hospice and so on. What led you into this particular topic?
Yeah, I've been doing end of life stuff for many years. Even when I was a parish pastor, it seemed like it followed me, and I've done like 1,100 funerals now, so working with families in grief and crisis a lot. And one of the things that I have become aware of is that sometimes persons who are grieving that are a part of a faith community or church, it's kind of assumed they're taken care of, that the pastor's going to do it, that their grief needs will be met, that they're people of great faith, and so they're not going to need a whole lot. And they sometimes get missed. You get down the road and realize that they haven't had a lot of grief support. They're afraid to, some are afraid to tell the church about it because they're going to question their faith or something. One of the stories I tell in the book is about a lady in one of my congregations who came to me who thought she'd lost all of her faith. One of the most wonderful Christian ladies I've ever met. And I asked her why, and she said, because after my husband died, I thought I would be happy because he wasn't suffering anymore, and I knew he was going to heaven, but I can't understand why I'm sad. I shouldn't be sad if I had any faith at all. And she was ashamed to acknowledge that in the context of the church, and came to me, privately to deal with that. And I think that goes on more than we know. And the other thing that brought me to it is I know for a fact that a lot of faith communities and clergy don't have a lot of background in grief ministry and grief support, and I felt like this might be helpful for those in particular.
Yeah, I can certainly testify from experience that if I mention my own experience with grief in a church group, and for me it's not generally preaching but rather teaching, especially small groups, that you really open the floodgates by simply acknowledging the impact of grief, and there'll be people who thought that faith should keep them from the sense of loss. So
It's going to feel like they
yeah,
should be insulated by that faith.
yeah,
Yeah.
so that's interesting. Now, one of the points that I'm hearing here, when you're talking faith community, and you mentioned particularly church, of course, you and I, our experience is both primarily churches, although I know you've worked for hospice, which is very much interfaith. When you wrote this book, you were thinking of the broader faith communities, other communities as well. Is that, or
Yes.
this is not, how should I say, bound by Christian theology?
No, I really intentionally tried to write so in a manner that would be helpful for Jewish faith communities, Islamic faith communities, whatever it may be. Um, so I tried to be broad in that sense and not be real Christian theological. And I'll bet you that all those faith communities can relate to, when there's been a death and it's time for casseroles in the home, and casseroles after a celebration of life or something, that when the casseroles are gone, sometimes people get lost who are grieving, and there's not a lot of follow-up.
Okay, I think that's an important point for people to realize, is that this is not strictly for just a Christian audience. So appreciate you mentioning that. And so I think you started to identify, but I want to underline a little bit. You're in this book. You're looking when you talk about when the casseroles are gone. I know casseroles are such a cliche in Christian community and support. People show up for you with the casseroles and so on. But for those who might not be thinking about it, we're talking about what happens after the immediate impact of grief. And perhaps you can comment again. I've noticed that people who expect an initial grief expect that same faith shield to get you over it really quickly. Other people have a timetable, so maybe you could comment on that, because that would be the need you're addressing, is after that initial outsurge, and then
Mhm.
suddenly everybody forgets it happened.
Yeah, well, and it's very natural for people who are somehow around the person who has experienced a death to move on with life. I mean, they can't stay stuck in that person's grief forever. They have to move on. That's normal. But sometimes we forget that person that we brought the casseroles to and went and picked up our casserole dishes is still stuck there, and is left with that grief to deal with. And uh, there's no time limit on that. And often it's after, and I think most people who've had any experience with death of someone close realize that it's after the funeral, after those first few weeks, after the family has all gone back to their homes, after everybody else has gone back to work and gone on with their lives, that it becomes the worst. The grief really hits when everything else goes back to normal and you're still there with your grief. And so that's why I came up with the title, After the Casseroles Are Gone. This is after all of the things have happened that normally happen after a death within a faith community. Um, but what do we do with those people that are still there, that are still stuck, that are still experiencing their grief and not quite sure what to do with it?
Yeah, I want to underline what you said there. There isn't a time limit. Because there's a lot of, I've heard that question a lot. How long is this going to last?
Yeah.
And both from the person experiencing it, but from others. How long is so and so going to be grieving? All I can
Yeah.
testify is, my son died 19 years ago, and it can be yesterday in 30 seconds.
Yeah,
You know, I
yeah, I'm
mean,
sure.
it's just, and so I want to underline that point that you're making, that there isn't a time limit
Yeah,
on what's going
not at
on.
all. Yeah.
So with that, and what we're asked, what I'm looking at here is, who are the primary readers that you're trying to address this to? Are we talking pastors, church leaders, everybody in the church? And what kind of a priority? Who were you thinking of the most in setting this up?
Um, Probably it's going to come through the pastor or faith community leader first. Um, but I also see this as a possibly somewhat of a training manual on grief support and grief ministry for people in the faith community who want to follow up, who want to be a part of a ministry to folks who have experienced grief, or for someone who even just has a friend, a close friend or something, but they don't understand grief, haven't had much experience with it, would like to know more. That's why I really spend some time in the book outlining some of the research on grief and some of the ways that grief happens and evolves and unravels for people through especially those early days in the first year or so. Um, and then the book also then has a sample process of, if you wanted to set up a year's uh, grief ministry to someone in the congregation, there is a sample process of how that can be done, with mailings and visits and setting up a bereavement team of people who can be trained to do that kind of follow-up. So it doesn't all fall on the pastor.
Yeah, so it is generally, this would be a good manual in a church that wanted to set up a team, ministry team, however they want to phrase that, but a group of people who will take responsibility for making sure that these things happen.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as your publisher, I want to emphasize here that there's a very strong, I wouldn't even say strong practical element. The practical side underlies this, this entirely process. This book is not about the theory of doing, but rather about the doing of doing. You do talk about the theory, but you bring everything down to practical action through
That
there.
was the goal.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so that's excellent. Um, I have the intention of asking you to outline a little bit of your own experience, but I'm going to wait till the end of the interview just before I put up your book, and I'm going to say, talk about your experience with hospice and the training that you've gone into in order to prepare for this. And by the way, while we're here, you are available, even though you, through COVID and everything, you went to a book, you are available to do workshops, right?
Absolutely. Specifically on this topic, if a church wants somebody to come in and train those people, I'm happy to do that. Can do a weekend kind of a training. Plus, I do workshops on all kinds of topics around end of life, death, dying, and bereavement.
Okay, and folks, I will, the link and the QR code that I put in the end will include a way to get more information on asking Dan to do such a workshop for you. So now let's look at. I'm going to ask specifically about the church, even though we're talking about other faith communities, because I think both of our experiences tend to be a little bit more in church as opposed to these other faith
Mhm.
communities. How would you grade the church broadly, in about our our response to those who have suffered loss? How are we doing on this overall?
One of the concerns I had is that faith communities or pastors reading this might feel like I'm beating them up uh, uh, for not doing a good job. But I have statistics from one community faith survey that indicates that less than half of clergy in this community felt qualified or comfortable doing grief support. Less than half. Um, and that's kind of telling. It's not that they're doing it wrong. It's just that they've not been trained. They've not been given the tools and the resources. If you think back to, as I think back to seminary, yeah, I got some grief stuff, but not nearly what I should have had. Uh, One of the first congregations I went to as a pastor, it was an elderly congregation. As my wife said, you basically buried the whole congregation. I mean, we just had death after death after death. And I had to learn pretty quick how to deal with that. Luckily, I had a good mentor who was good at that. But I just think as congregations or as churches, we sometimes, again, we think we've done the initial stuff, we've done the first couple of weeks, we've done the funeral, we've done the celebration. Life is going to go on, and sometimes it's standing up there as a worship leader or pastor and starting to sing a hymn that was maybe sung at that person's funeral, to see their widow or spouse begin to weep hearing that song and get up and leave the church. Who's going to walk out with her, and who's going to be with her through that? It's just my experience. Well, in my experience in hospice, I did grief support groups, and what I heard from people, and even as a pastor sometimes, I heard from people who said the church was there for the first couple weeks of the first month, but then they weren't there anymore. I didn't feel like I could talk about it with anybody. I didn't want to burden everybody else, of course, what you hear from people. Nobody wants to hear me, cry about it anymore. And so they kind of go underground. The church is there, but what people are telling me and have been telling me, both through the survey as well as their experience and their stories, is that the follow-up isn't there, that they would like to have more support down the road as they're dealing with the grief, and good information, have good information about the grief process and what they can expect.
Okay, and that would probably, a strong point on that would be the aspect that you have in the book of building a ministry team. Because, from my non-pastor perspective, even though I share experiences of seminary, but I never have pastored a church. But my observation is that the pastor is expected to know and to be able to do way more things than any human can do.
True. True.
And again, and this is the publisher emphasizing a value of the book, is the part about establishing a ministry team to cover these sorts of things. Because one of the questions I know you'd be asked, because I've been asked it by pastors over and over again, this is a really good book you're trying to sell me on various books that we sell, but how do I have time to both learn this and do this? And of course you don't. And that's why we're talking about a ministry team.
Yeah. And in that same survey, one of the things that pastors told us was, I don't have time to, if you've had several deaths, I don't have time to do this, do that kind of follow-up for everybody.
Right. And they won't.
Physically, I don't have time.
Yeah. I've sometimes said the most ungodly thing about the church is the pastor's job description, especially if you're honest about it.
Yeah.
So that might actually, I've already said, but let's go ahead and say it anyway, the one most important thing you'd like to change about the church's response to grief, or faith community response to grief. It seems like you've actually been saying that for the last several minutes.
Yeah. Just that the church understands that grief is a lifelong process. You don't get over it. And everybody's grief is different. And once you've had a significant loss and are grieving and mourning, the mourning changes, the way we grieve. But the fact is, the grief will be there the rest of our lives. and I know you can attest to that in your own experience, but it just doesn't go away. And just because everybody else moves on with life doesn't mean that person who experienced the grief is going to get better right away. Like you say, when am I going to get over it? Well, the mourning, the feeling and expression will change.
Yeah.
But the grief, as long as there is love and a memory of that love, there's grief.
Yeah. Yeah, I can testify that I think my unscientific personal survey of the last 19 years, the question I am most commonly asked is, when are we going to get over this?
Mm-hmm.
I'll let you know when I do, but I don't really expect.
Yeah, don't stand by the phone waiting for me to call.
Yeah. Okay. So with that, talking about grief in general, what would you list as, I think we've just done one. Misconception is that you're going to get over it. But misconceptions about grief that we might want to try to correct or gently adjust, however you want to phrase it.
I think certainly that you get over grief, or there's some kind of a timeline, and that if you make it to 2 years down the road and you're still grieving, there's something wrong with you. What I tell people is the grief goes on, the mourning changes. Like I said, that someday you're going to realize that you think you have certain memories, and you realize you're laughing about them instead of crying about them, and then you know that maybe you're turning a corner on that mourning, but the grief doesn't go away. You wouldn't want the grief to go away, because that would mean the love goes away. And the other thing is, there are always people ready to tell you how they dealt with their grief and why you're not doing it right. I tried to make that a pretty strong statement in the book as well, because people do, they've gone through their grief and they got through it a certain way, and they think because they did it, you can do it that way. And everybody grieves differently. There's no two grief, because the grief is as unique as the relationship you had with that person. A husband and a wife don't grieve the same, and often get into trouble because they expect that they should be grieving the same. They're not going to, because it wasn't the same relationship with that child. Let's say your 19-year-old son that you lost so tragically. You had a different relationship with him than your wife did. You wouldn't have to. You're different people. And so you grieve that relationship differently and that loss differently. So that's one of the things that I think is a real misnomer, that everybody grieves the same, and because I got through it a certain way, then if you do what I did, you'll get through it in the same way.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that from my experience of my wife and I, who were doing weekend seminars during the time, not about grief, but once the story of our son's passing came out, there's always, every audience there was a lot of people, and she and I had to have a discussion, because we already knew that we processed the grief differently. And I mean, as a simple a thing as her revisits almost always have to do with specific dates, like his birthday, that sort of thing, whereas mine are almost random. Mm-hmm. And we had to have this discussion. How are we going to talk to people? And we chose to jointly talk to people, each with our own way, so that they would hear the two completely different ways. And what we found was the audiences responded. Nobody even really noticed the difference in the way, except that they were responding to one or the other separately. Sure. So you'd find that through the audience. So I really appreciate you bringing that point out, because we've lived it in this household.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Over and over. I'll find her down and I'll be wondering why, and it's a date that I actually forgot.
Yeah.
Or she finds me down and this isn't related to anything. What's going on? Well, I was looking at his picture that sits on my desk,
Hmm.
and it hit.
Today it hit me differently than it does other days. Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
there every day, but one day it's the thing. So,
Yeah.
is there anything else, misconceptions that you'd like to cover? Of course, we want to make sure people read your book to get some more. Uh,
Yeah.
but,
um,
or does that?
I think just the misconception that just because you've gone through all the right motions, you've gone through a funeral or memorial service, um, that you should be done. It should be over. That you should be fine now. That you should feel better. Um, that whole issue, and I mentioned this in the book too. I hate the term. I dislike the term used around death of closure. That, well, if you do, you need to do this so you have closure. Well, that's an okay word if it comes in terms of viewing a body, but you don't ever find closure, as you've just indicated through your experience. You don't find closure from a death because the grief goes on, and just the expectation that there's a way to deal with it, and it's all going to go away, um, is difficult. And I find another thing that concerns me is the number of people who choose not to have any services at all, and how that impacts grief. Because I think ritual is so important, and celebrating that life and acknowledging it. I really, really struggle, with not having anything, just uh, no acknowledgement really publicly or ritualistically, in some form.
At some point, either now or later, I'd like to know if you have any recommended resources for pastors who are being called on to perform a funeral, because I would imagine that's one of the harder services to set up.
Hmm.
And I wonder how much training pastors have specifically for that.
Probably not a lot.
It just strikes me, as it's got to be difficult. So I'll ask you for that somewhere down the road.
Okay.
Let's turn to the more, just a couple of minutes of the practical side, because I am a publisher. I am here trying to sell your book. Although in this case, I'm very happy to be saying, I also have a great investment in the topic, and so on. So you've done. Let's look a little bit at your experience. You've worked for hospice for a number of years. You've
12
been a
years.
hospice chaplain, 12
Hmm.
years.
12 years as chaplain and also a grief specialist.
Okay, and you've also done hospital chaplaincy.
Yeah, I did 12 years hospital chaplaincy as well, and uh, focused a lot on end of life there. And of course, they call a chaplain when someone dies, and in the ER when there's a sudden death or a crisis. Um, I was a part of those teams, and mhm.
So besides your pastoral training, you've done a considerable amount of training in specifically death, uh, and grieving, both before, and during the process and after, right?
Yeah, I early on, or a number of years ago, when I started doing chaplaincy, I realized that I really wanted to do more and more continuing education in that area. First through the what was it, American Association of Bereavement, but then later I joined the Association for Death Education and Counseling, which is the preeminent uh, group for those who are studying this, and did a whole lot of continuing education and attending seminars. Received my certification in thanatology. For those who don't speak Greek, thanatology is the study of death, dying, and bereavement. And so I have that certificate through Association Death Education and Counseling. And I continue, they require a lot of continuing education that you continue to do that. I've led workshops at their meetings, national meetings, and but yeah, I've very much continued to educate myself, but not nearly as well as the people that I've worked with have educated me. People who are grieving, people who are dealing with their own death coming, and dealing with their anticipatory grief, and the loss that they are experiencing day by day by day, and their search for hope as they approach death, what that hope's going to look like. Done a lot of work on that topic in specific, and so yeah, the education that I have continued to get and still continue to get through those organizations, and then as well as the experience in hospital and in hospice, working with those families and patients. And like I said, I've done a fair number of, more than my share of funerals over the years, get called on quite a bit for them. And that means working with a family, although I don't get a chance to really follow up with them, but working with a family to prepare for that time and create ritual and celebration around a person's life.
It's interesting there. I think that this comes up frequently in people who have studied various ministry topics, is that willingness to listen and to learn from the people that you're serving becomes a central core to so many. So I'm interested but not surprised to hear you put it in there.
Yeah, no, that my teachers were the people that I met in the hospital, and I met in their homes with hospice, and yeah, that's where you gain that's the greatest knowledge you'll get. But you have to be open to it.
Yes.
If you think you know everything about grief, and if I thought I knew everything there was to know about it, I wouldn't still be learning.
Okay, well, folks, the book that we're talking about here is When the Casseroles Are Gone. And it deals with ministry past the initial time of grief and following up through the faith community with people who have experienced a loss, who are grieving. And it's a very practical book. You'll be seeing at this point, you'll be seeing a QR code that you can point your cell phone camera at, and also a link that you can use with your browser on this video to get more information. That will include information on the book, as well as how to contact Dan if you would like seminar, workshop, anything of that nature, and information on more resources. I appreciate everybody listening, and Dan, I thank you for being with us and for the work that you put into this, getting this information out.
Well, thank you for this opportunity, and for taking the chance to publish the thing.